At 8 on a Saturday morning in February 1972, a wall of black water came down a hollow in West Virginia. It was 30 feet high, and it was not water. It was coal waste. 132 million gallons of it, held back by a pile of the mine's own garbage, stacked across a creek above 16 towns. Saunders, Pardee, Laredo, Amherstdale. It took all of them in under an hour. 125 people died. 4,000 had nowhere to sleep that night. 4 days earlier, a federal mine inspector had walked that pile, filled out a form, and written one word: satisfactory. This is not a story about structures nobody checked. Every structure in this video was checked. Every single one of them had a signature on it. That is the part you can't see. A dam holds water. This is not a dam. When you mine, you crush the rock. You take the fraction of a percent that is worth money, and you are left with everything else. Ground stone, process water, whatever chemistry it took to separate them. That mixture is called tailings, and there is no market for it. So it is pumped into a valley and walled in. 3 things make that wall different from every other wall in engineering. It is never emptied. It grows for the working life of the mine, raised in stages, year after year. It is often built out of the waste itself, the upstream method, where each new wall stands on the tailings already dumped behind the last one. And it does not drain when it fails. Saturated tailings liquefy. The wall does not leak. The contents become a fluid and go looking for the lowest ground, which is where people build towns. March the 28th, 1965, 12:35 in the afternoon. An earthquake of roughly magnitude 7.5 hit the coast north of Valparaiso. Chile is the most seismic mining country on Earth, and everyone in the industry knew it. Above the copper mining town of El Cobre stood 2 tailings impoundments. The older one had been commissioned in 1930, the newer one in 1963, 2 years before. Both were built the same way: sand tailings raised on top of themselves upstream. The shaking lasted long enough to liquefy them. The 2 structures released roughly 350,000 cubic meters and 1.9 million cubic meters. The flow ran 12 kilometers down the valley. El Cobre was in the way. The town was not damaged. The town was buried. The official count was 247, and it has never been settled. Estimates run to 400. Here is what makes El Cobre the first entry and not a footnote. The failure mechanism was not exotic. Engineers had understood since the 1930s that saturated sand liquefies under cyclic loading. Chile had experienced a magnitude 9.5 earthquake 5 years earlier, in 1960, the largest ever recorded anywhere. The impoundments above El Cobre were authorized, built, and raised as though none of that applied to them. Chile learned. Within a few years, it became one of the first countries in the world to restrict the upstream method outright. Remember that. It matters in 54 years. 19 months later, on the 21st of October, 1966, a school in a Welsh mining village was waiting for the last day before half-term. Above Aberfan stood 7 spoil tips, the rock and shale hauled out of the Merthyr Vale colliery and dumped on the mountainside. Tip 7 had been started in 1958. By that morning, it stood 111 feet high. At 9:15, it moved. 150,000 cubic meters of saturated colliery spoil came down the slope and into Pantglass Junior School. 144 people were killed. 116 of them were children. An entire cohort of one village in one building in about 5 minutes. Now the paperwork. Tip 7 had been built in part on ground from which springs emerged. Saturated spoil behaves exactly like saturated tailings. It liquefies and it flows. Building a tip on top of active springs was not a subtle oversight. It was against the National Coal Board's own written procedures. And the springs were not a secret. They were printed on Ordnance Survey maps of that hillside from 1873, 93 years before. The villagers knew they were there. They had complained about the tip. Their complaints had been filed and ignored. The tribunal that followed was chaired by Lord Justice Edmund Davies. Its report did not hedge. It placed blame squarely on the National Coal Board and named 9 of its staff as bearing some degree of responsibility. Not one of them was prosecuted. Not one was demoted. Not one lost their job. The Coal Board remained the Coal Board. The map from 1873 remained in the archive, still showing the springs, still perfectly accurate. 6 years later, and 4,000 miles west, the same physics found a hollow in Logan County, West Virginia. Pittston Coal ran a preparation plant on Buffalo Creek. The slurry from washing the coal went behind 3 refuse dams stacked up the Middle Fork. Dam 3 sat at the top of the chain and held about 132 million gallons. It was not engineered. It was dumped. Coal refuse pushed across a stream until the water stopped going through it. On the 22nd of February, 1972, a federal mine inspector examined the impoundment and recorded its condition as satisfactory. 4 days later, at around 8 in the morning on the 26th, Dam 3 failed. It took the 2 dams below it with it, which is what those chains always do. The wave that reached the valley floor was over 30 feet high, and it had 16 communities in front of it. 125 people were killed. 1,121 were injured. 4,000 were left with no home. The hazard was not new information. It had been flagged for at least 4 years, by residents, by state officials, by federal officials. The warnings were heeded by nobody. Not the company, not the state, not Washington. Pittston's public position after the disaster was that the failure had been an act of God. A governor's commission investigated and reached a different conclusion. The word satisfactory had been written down 4 days before 125 people died, by a man who was paid by the public to write it. That is the whole channel in one sentence. 13 years on, in the Dolomites, above a village of about 20 buildings. The Prestavel mine took fluorite out of the mountain above Val di Stava. Its tailings went into 2 basins built one above the other on the slope, the lower one from the 1960s, the upper one raised in stages from 1969 onwards. On the 19th of July, 1985, a clear summer day in the middle of the holiday season, the front of the upper basin gave way. 180,000 cubic meters of mud came out. It picked up the lower basin on the way through and hit the village at something close to 90 kilometers an hour. 268 people died. 8 were pulled out alive. The basins had been raised and raised again for 16 years on an assumption that the tailings underneath were consolidating and could carry the weight of what was being stacked on top. No monitoring system was ever installed to check whether that assumption was true. Not one instrument for 16 years. Italy prosecuted. 10 people were convicted of culpable disaster and multiple manslaughter, the managers of the mine and the officials of the companies that built and raised the upper basin across those 16 years. And this is the part that separates Stava from everything before it. The convictions also included officials of the mining district of the autonomous province of Trento, not for building it, for failing to carry out the checks. For the first time, the inspection itself was the crime. 9 years later, on the 22nd of February, 1994, in the Free State Goldfields, Harmony Gold's No. 4 tailings dam stood 320 meters up the slope from Merriespruit, a suburb of the town of Virginia. The northern wall was 31 meters high. The houses below it were ordinary houses on ordinary streets, belonging mostly to people who worked at the mine. That afternoon, a thunderstorm dropped about 50 millimeters of rain in half an hour. A tailings impoundment has to keep a margin between the surface of the pond inside it and the top of the wall. That margin is called freeboard, and it is not a nicety. It is the entire defense against a storm. The mandated freeboard for that dam was not there. At around 9:30 at night, the northern wall breached. More than 2.5 million tons of liquefied tailings went through Merriespruit in the dark, while people were asleep. 17 people were killed. Around 80 houses were largely swept away, and 200 more were severely damaged. At the inquest, the judge described the structure in 4 words: a time bomb waiting to explode. South Africa responded with a mandatory code of practice for mine residue deposits, a real regulatory instrument that still governs those structures today, which tells you that the rules were writable. They had simply not been written yet, and 17 people were the reason they finally were. 16 years later, in western Hungary, the material was not gray. The alumina plant at Ica, run by a company called MAL, processed bauxite into aluminium oxide. The residue from that process is called red mud, and it is strongly caustic, high enough in pH to burn skin on contact. It was stored in a series of open reservoirs. On the 4th of October 2010, at 12:30 in the afternoon, the embankment of reservoir number 10 failed. Between 600,000 and 700,000 cubic meters of red mud and water went down the Torna Creek and into 3 settlements: Kolontár, Devichair, and Somlovashahe. It covered 800 hectares. 10 people were killed. Around 120 were injured, and the injuries here were different from every other case in this video. People were not crushed. They were burned by standing in it. Now, the document. Inspectors from the Hungarian government's environmental authority examined that reservoir less than 2 weeks before it failed. They detected no structural weakness. They reported that everything was in order. And afterwards, an aerial photograph surfaced. It had been taken in June of 2010, nearly 4 months before the breach. In it, red staining is visible running through the wall of the reservoir, in exactly the place that gave way. The photograph existed before the inspection did. The clean bill of health was issued anyway, by people whose entire job was to look at that wall. 5 years later, in Minas Gerais, the numbers stop being comparable to anything above. The Fundão Dam was part of the Germano complex, operated by Samarco, a joint venture of Vale and BHP, 2 of the largest mining companies on the planet. Not a marginal operator, not a village colliery. On the 5th of November 2015, Fundão failed and released around 32 million cubic meters of iron ore tailings. Compare that to Stava, 180,000. This was 177 times larger. The village of Bento, Rodrigues, sat 8 kilometers downstream. It no longer exists. Paracatu de Baixo was destroyed after it. 19 people were killed, a number that is only that low because the mud arrived in the afternoon and the villages were small. Then it kept going. The tailings entered the Rio Doce and traveled 668 kilometers of watercourse, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And here is the document for this one, and it is not an inspection report. Before the failure, Samarco had itself modeled what a Fundão collapse would do. The company's own assessment projected greater than 20 fatalities and permanent disability in over 100 people. They were not caught by surprise by the consequence. They had written the consequence down in their own file, in their own words. Then they kept raising the dam. 3 years and 2 months after Bento Rodrigues, the same company, the same state, the same method. Dam 1 at the Córrego do Feijão mine in Brumadinho was owned and operated by Vale. It was an upstream dam, the technique that liquefied above El Cobre in 1965. On the 25th of January 2019, at about noon, it failed. The mud went first through Vale's owned administrative building and staff canteen at lunchtime. 270 people were killed. Most of them worked for the company that owned the dam. Now the signature, and this is the most documented one in the entire video. In September 2018, 4 months before the collapse, the German certification company TÜV Süd issued the Declaration of Stability for Dam 1. During that assessment, TÜV Süd's own Brazilian engineers found that the dam did not reach the required stability factor under their calculation standards. They did not refuse to certify it. According to the case documentation, they went looking for different calculation methods that would produce the result the client wanted. 9 months before the failure, an internal TÜV Süd email had already warned about the threat the structure posed. And through 2017 and 2018, Vale told its shareholders publicly that the Brumadinho dam had passed all relevant safety inspections. It pointed to the TÜV Süd certification as the proof. Every one of those statements was true. That is what makes it the worst case here. The dam was certified. The certificate was real. The certifier was a serious international firm with a serious reputation. The certificate simply did not describe the dam. 8 structures: Chile, Wales, West Virginia, Italy, South Africa, Hungary, Brazil. 54 years, 6 continents worth of legal systems, and 1 file that reads the same every time. Somebody looked at the wall. Somebody wrote down that it was acceptable. Somebody signed. And then the wall did what the material underneath it was always going to do. There is a 9th I left out, and the reason is the point. On the 1st of May 1966, a tailings dam above the Bulgarian village of Skorigrad failed. The official death toll was 107. The database kept by the Center for Science in Public Participation records 488. Police went house to house, confiscating the photographs residents had taken. I could not put Skorigrad in the list, because I cannot tell you how many people died there. That is not a gap in the research. That is the finished product of a state that decided the number was the problem. So, how many of these are standing right now, above somewhere? Nobody knows. That is the honest answer, and it is worse than a large number would be. The Global Tailings Portal holds detailed records on more than 1,700 tailings dams worldwide. That database does not exist because a government built it. It exists because the Church of England's Pension Board and the Ethics Council of Sweden's national pension funds wrote to mining companies and asked them to disclose. Investors asked. The companies answered. That is the mechanism. The best available estimates of the true global total run from 3,500 to 18,000 structures. The gap between those two numbers is the measure of how little anyone actually knows. In 2020, the industry published a global industry standard on tailings management. It is a real document, written by serious people, and it is voluntary. The upstream method, El Cobre, 1965, Brumadinho, 2019, is now banned in Brazil and restricted in Chile. In most of the world, it is still legal. The last dam on this list failed 7 years ago. It was inspected, calculated, certified, and declared stable by a firm whose business is certifying that things are safe. Somewhere above a town tonight, there is a wall holding back several million tons of mud, and a folder in an office confirming it is fine. Only one of those two things is load-bearing.